Good morning from Melbourne and welcome everyone to the latest episode of GrowthChat. Today I'm super delighted that we can welcome Abramitzky from Stanford University and Leah Boustan from Princeton University. I've known both of them for quite a long time. Ran, I guess, more from his visits to Warwick, probably 10 years ago. Leah from a year I spent at UCLA, when she was still working there. And both of them have long worked on migration, immigration, and have now written a book. And the book is called Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. And it's an amazing book, truly amazing. I enjoyed reading it a lot. And so I hope you can summarize it for our listeners. Welcome, Ran. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much, Sascha, and thank you, Marco, for having us. It's a pleasure to be here in 3 different time zones. I'll give you our book is about immigration in the US. It's a result of 15 years of research that Leah and I have been doing together. We bring data and long-term perspective on the immigration debate in the US, which is often based on fear and anecdotes rather than on evidence and facts. We often hear this nostalgic view that European immigrants in the past assimilated very quickly, and that is in contrast to new immigrant groups today that do not even attempt to assimilate in the United States. And so we build data on millions of immigrant lives to reassess common myths about immigration and the American dream over 2 centuries. Things like, is it really true that today's immigrants are less upwardly mobile than past immigrants? Is it really true that today's immigrants are less likely to become Americans and to integrate more slowly into society than those Ellis Island generations in the past? Is it really true that immigrants today generate more anti-immigrant sentiment and things like that? And, do immigrants steal the jobs and reduce the wages of the US born, and their success necessarily come at the expense of the US born? And you can kind of think of us like the curious grandchildren searching for their own grandparents and multiply this effort by millions. And so, including, in the process, finding Leah's family who moved to the United States, my family that moved to the United States. We can talk about that later, maybe. And overall, what we find is that the American dream, when it comes to immigrants come to the United States and eventually them and their families make it into the US society and economy, this American dream for immigrants is just as alive now as it was 100 years ago, and that immigration has always been more of a novel than a short story. So there are 3 parts to that novel. The first part, immigrants move to the US and they double or more than double their income by moving their home country, which is often poorer than the United States, especially today. Then there is the second part. It doesn't involve the myth rags to riches, that they immediately come here with nothing in their pocket and quickly rise to riches. But immigrants converge somewhat with the US-born workers, but they also struggle and often remain in lower-paying jobs and so on. And then the third chapter, where the children of immigrants from almost every country catch up and are remarkably upwardly mobile, both in the past and today. So that's kind of like the bird's eye view of the book, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. And that, I think, even I, who has followed that literature, hadn't seen in that clarity. So you also bring so much together, because often we consume papers as academics one by one. There is this result, and by you pulling it all together, it becomes so clear that the past and the present are so similar in so many respects. So I found that very insightful.
Thank you, Sascha. And I just would say that this is what led us to write the book, is that, you know, with individual papers, you can make like a short points and summarize and like a, you know, like a short, small questions. But in a book, it's only after really we worked for a decade together that even for us, these things started to click. So it really does take a lot of like writing many individual papers, connecting the dots. And only when we found that we felt that the whole is much bigger than the sum of its parts, that we decided to write this book. So I'm happy that you also felt that way.
Yeah, definitely. Now, then another aspect that I love about the book is this whole debunking myths. Yeah, so be it that you have these big points that you just described, that today immigrants no longer integrate, but also what I like is you pick individual biographies. You like say, okay, there is this story about some person where everyone believes that is how it went. And then you went back to the records and you say, no, it's not true. It's a lie. People got it wrong. So can you say a bit more about how that idea came to your mind to tie that in?
Well, we did want to bring in individual stories and anecdotes because we feel that people can only relate so much to data and facts, and they can learn and connect the material much better from stories. But at the same time, stories can be so misleading when it comes to immigration. You know, sometimes you'll hear on the positive side about someone like Steve Jobs, who was the child of immigrants, or Elon Musk, who is himself an immigrant. And then you might conclude, oh, immigrants are very entrepreneurial, they'll become CEOs. Or you might hear about a notorious murderer. And indeed, there are many immigrant murderers, just as there are many US born murderers. And if you pick out those stories, you might conclude that immigrants are likely to commit crimes. So it's very important when you bring in anecdotes to make sure that they match with the facts. So we always started with the data and the facts and to try to bring together cases where we have millions of records. But then once we see what the patterns look like more broadly there, we try to find stories that illustrate those patterns and find anecdotes that would speak to some of the mechanisms that are underlying the patterns that we see. And so you're absolutely right, Sascha, that one of my favorite stories in the book is the story of Annie Moore, who was, uh, and, and really she was the first immigrant to come from Europe and settle by walking through Ellis Island. And Ellis Island opened in 1892. She was the very first immigrant to step on Ellis Island and then from there get processed and moved to the US. But the story of what happened to her after the fact turned out to be completely wrong. So there was this very uplifting story about how Annie Moore quickly made her way up the ladder in the US and married a guy in Texas who got rich owning land. And it turns out that that was the wrong Annie Moore. And if you go back to the data and historical records, you can see that the Annie Moore who lived in Texas was US born. She was born in Illinois. She was not the immigrant Annie Moore who had come through Ellis Island. And so that's a great way of illustrating the power of some of these genealogical records that we use in the book. It's one particular story, but it illustrates the power of the data more broadly.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Also, because what a takeaway I had is you are also educating your readers, not just about this particular topic of immigration, but more generally, not to trust every story you hear and to try to find out the facts. I found that very good. Now, you already touched on that before, that after you've done so much research in this area, it occurred to you, you should pull it all together. But then some academics would maybe write a big survey article, again, for academics, but you decided to write a book, and one that's very easy to read and entertaining. So you are trying to reach the general public. So what made you choose that avenue?
Well, I think that if we trace it back, it goes back to the 2016 presidential campaign and the Trump campaign in 2015. And for the first time, in recent memory, we were hearing very open xenophobic statements, part of the public discourse. And just a few years before that, there had been hope for comprehensive immigration reform. There was a package that was put forward and passed in the Senate with 8 members of the Senate, 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats working together to build that bill. I think that was right around the time that Sascha was visiting at UCLA. And so what changed within 2 years, 2013 to 2015, and then with the Trump presidency, Ron and I started to take more seriously some of the comparisons between past and present, and the fact that the rhetoric that we heard from the Trump presidency was not at all new within the larger sweep of US history, actually. It sounded new to us, but if we go back to the historical record, it was not at all new. And we thought that as economic historians, we had something to add to the public discussion. Beyond just the walls of academia, that some of our findings may actually touch people and help people pay more attention to what our immigration policy should be.
Thank you. Marco, do you have some questions?
Yes. So I was actually thinking about this, and I really like the approach that you guys use in telling the little stories. So I can relate. I moved to Australia, so I'm an immigrant myself, and there was one story that you guys told about the guy that thought that the city was made of gold, and it wasn't made of gold, and that impressed him, and then the city was to be made by him. So that was my favorite part of the book. That's where I thought, okay, telling those little stories that I can relate to, where everything is amazing, you have expectations, and then you face a new reality. That was the best part. And I wonder, what is the best part for you? Like, why you write the book? What made you think writing the book? I was like, that's pretty cool.
So I guess I hear 2 questions there. One, that you are asking what are our favorite part of the book, and then you're asking why did we write it. So maybe I'll say something. I'll start with the favorite part. Maybe Leah can tell her and also tell why we write the book. But like, just to say I really do like the quote that you mentioned. I have to say, this is we like it so much that we chose it as the title of our book, because we felt it captured something very, very deep, which is, the whole Streets of Gold was this shorthand for the idea that you could arrive to the US with nothing in your pocket, but then quickly find opportunity. So you might read the title and say, oh, that book will be about that. But we really chose it as a title because this unknown Italian immigrant in the 1900s said something like, I came to America because I heard the streets there were paved with gold. But when I got here, I found out 3 things. First, the streets were not paved with gold. And second, they were not paved at all. And finally, I was the one expected to pave them. So this captured for us the entire idea of the myth versus facts in US, the myths versus facts in US immigration history. This immigrant knew better. He knew that the immigrants had to pave their way rather than moves from rags to riches. But my favorite part of the book is the one about the children of immigrants and how upwardly mobile the children of immigrants are, and how comparable today relative to this Ellis Island era. So this is, by the way, based on work we've done with Santiago Perez and Elisa Giacome. And, we find that the children of immigrants are very upwardly mobile. And in fact, when we do this more apple-to-apple comparison and look at the children growing up to equally poor parents, so think about those growing up to families in the 25th percentile of the income distribution, we find that both today and in the past, the children of immigrants are very economically mobile, more so than the children of US-born parents who grew up in similar households, and that this is true for families today from nearly every sending country, including from poorer countries like El Salvador, Mexico, Laos, and that the children of immigrants from Mexico and the Dominican Republic today are just as likely to move up from their parents' circumstances as were those children of poor Swedes and Danes 100 years ago. That is something that I think it really changed the way we think about things. This surprised us a great deal, and we found to be a very interesting and insightful finding. So that's my favorite.
So my favorite parts of the book are the different moments when Ron and I got a chance to work with colleagues outside of economics and to bring in data that you might not typically think about as an economist. So we worked with a team of linguists on some data from the congressional record. And we also worked with a very interdisciplinary team, a geographer, a sociologist, and a linguist on analyzing some data that we collected from oral histories of immigrants telling their own stories. And so that was something that was very special to me. I hadn't had the opportunity to do that outside of the context of writing the book. And since then, we've published one of the papers, and we're working right now on an R&R on the other paper. So that's actually shaping my own research agenda at this moment. So I think, sort of getting back to this question of why write a book, that is an opportunity that you get in writing a book to really try to tell the story from a variety of angles. And sometimes that's outside of what you would typically do in an economics journal. And so we were able to find with the congressional record, for example, that attitudes towards immigrants today are actually more positive than they've ever been before, which that really floored us because we have been hearing a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric from Trump and the Trump administration. And it turns out that if you look at all members of Congress and members of the Senate, and you go back to the 1870s and forward to today, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, during the mass migration from Europe, almost every speech about immigrants was negative. And after World War II, leading up to the Cold War, there was a transition where many speeches became positive over time. Still, of course, there are many negative speeches, but the fact that there are positive speeches now too is something that's quite distinctive about our modern period. Now, of course, it's a bit polarized by party now, where you're more likely to hear a positive speech about immigrants from a Democratic politician than from a Republican politician. But the fact that we have positive speeches about immigrants at all is something that is quite unique in our history. And that's something that I was able to learn by working with linguists and with a very distinctive data source that I wouldn't have necessarily come across just working with economists.
So you did mention this distinction between economists and non-economists. What would you think a non-economist will find interesting then?
Yeah, I think the non-economist would find the combination of immigrant stories and findings from the big data the most interesting. So the findings based on the big data are informative about general patterns, but the immigrant stories are more relatable and attach a face and a story to the numbers. And so as Leah described before, we have this complicated relationship with story in this at some level, because we just mentioned that you can pick any story and then that become the fact. And so we thought long and hard about the kind of the stories that we pick to be to either demonstrate or complicate what we are finding in the book. But the idea was that the stories are for us a reminder that our big data is nothing more than a collection of many individual stories of immigrant simply lived in the US. So as Leah said, we don't just follow the mass murderer or the CEO, we follow the phone book, we follow everybody. And we tell the stories of many immigrant families, both in the past and today, that basically the idea is to bring the data to life. We tell stories of quite a few immigrants who passed through Ellis Island from various European countries, as well as the life journeys of Asian and Mexican immigrants who came to the country more recently. And we tell the story of some colleagues, like my colleague Tino Cuellar, whose grandfather was a rural shepherd in Mexico, and then became the judge in the Supreme Court of California. We tell the story of Leah's grandparents and my relatives who came from Eastern Europe and started as manual workers, and how their children eventually became doctors and a lawyer. And so the stories, what I think is nice is that the stories illustrate how each data point is actually an immigrant living their life, and exemplify how we collected the data, and also bring the findings to life. So I think it's the combination of, you don't just read the stories and you don't just read the data, boring statistics, but it's the combination, is that what I hope, let's say, that non-economists would appreciate.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of members of the public, the piece of the book that is most interesting is what Ron had been describing about the children of immigrants today, coming from where their parents had come from poor countries, and the children of immigrants are able to rise. So even if you're sympathetic to immigration, if you're maybe on the left or center left, and you think that immigration is in general positive for the economy, I think many people worry these days about the children of immigrants with parents coming from very poor countries. Parents may not have had an opportunity to even go to high school. And some of the parents are working in very low paid manual jobs, like in agriculture. What's going to happen to the kids? Are we going to have a permanent underclass? So you could be on the right or you could be on the left, and that might be a concern. And so for us to be able to point to children of immigrants from very poor countries, including countries where immigrants are coming across the southern border, where there's a lot of discussion about a border crisis these days. I think that really does blow people's minds. And so that's the piece that certainly it's interesting to economists too, but I think it's especially interesting to members of the public, and really does bust a myth that many people do have in mind.
Absolutely. No, I think the book has a very positive vibe, and it's not the shiny, everything is going to be good in 5 years after you arrive, but this second generation is going to thrive. It's a very positive message. I love that a lot. So you already touched on the fact that in the book you talk about your own family histories, and I wanted to ask you more generally in how far your own family history has influenced who you are as researchers and the kind of stuff you've worked on over the last 10, 15 years, say.
Well, I have to say, go ahead, Leah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was going to say that, my family came to the U.S. very early. My first ancestors came in 1882, which is right at the beginning of this mass migration from Europe, from Eastern and Southern Europe. And so I'm fourth generation American, and certainly there are some lingering family myths about immigration, but I think that I really uncovered all sorts of interesting facts about our family history that at this point have sort of been lost to the tellings and retellings. So it's not that I grew up with a very strong identity as a child of an immigrant or an immigrant myself, but I've learned a lot about my own family and how they fit in to the story of what we put together in the book. And it turns out that my family is very, very typical. They like to think of themselves, I think, as somehow more unique, but it turns out that they're very typical, that the immigrant generation themselves, and that was my great grandfather and grandmother, they never really moved up the economic ladder. Like the idea we have in the book that rags to riches is really overblown for the Ellis Island generation. They remained and not earning very much, and really sort of day to day in terms of trying to make a living and provide for their 8 kids. But by the time we got to the second generation, and that was my grandfather, my grandfather became a doctor and his younger brother became a lawyer. They were the youngest of 8. So their older siblings did not have the opportunity to go to college and to go on to professional schools, but the 7th and 8th child in the family did. And that again is really quite typical, that even though their parents were not earning very much, they were able to move up and experience social mobility and upward mobility. So I was able to find their records in the census data that we use, and they actually are part of our data set. So I learned a lot about my own family and how they fit in from this process.
And to me also, I myself an immigrant, of course, and in fact, everyone in my family is an immigrant one way or the other. My grandparents moved to my grandparents moved to Israel in the 1930s after, and then subsequently lost their entire family in the Holocaust. Some of them moved to Jerusalem, others moved to founded a kibbutz, which is another thing that I spend a chunk of my academic life working on. The other part moved to the United States. They have similar stories to Leah's parents. They were a spotter and a junk driver, and then their children became a lawyer and a doctor, and somehow I feel that it is the fact, the fact that it's so close to my heart, the immigration and income inequality and things like this, that is definitely from a very early on generated interest in immigration, and I was very happy to find my family too in the data that we collected, and Leah's family and many other. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Correct me if I'm wrong. You both wrote a book earlier, and those were single-authored books. Is that right? So is it more fun to write a book together?
Well, we wrote this book under COVID, and so there's no way that we would have been able to complete this book if we didn't have each other. I mean, it was as the world was turning upside down, and so I think that we really sustained each other and kept our project moving forward because we knew that there was someone on the other side who could, have the strength to keep going when you were feeling weak, and vice versa. When your co-author's feeling weak, then you're feeling strong. So we do have a lot more power together than we did when we were working alone.
And I will also add that it is way more fun to work with Leah than it was to work by myself. And by revealed preference, we worked together for 15 years, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say that I think that Leah is one of the best things that happened to my career, and also personally we are good friends, and so it really is a joy to work together. And I think that in general, I guess if you have young listeners listening to this podcast, there is something about working together with people who you like, and with people who you get along with, and people who you enjoy the intellectual activity. There is research can be long and hard and tedious, and doing it by yourself is much less fun than doing it with someone else. And that someone else better be somebody that you enjoy working with and that you get along with, rather than choosing strategically based on some complementarity of skills or things like that. So in our case, it's been a huge pleasure for me, at least, Leah.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, co-authoring is like a marriage without the kids. Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much. No, that was fantastic. And yeah, you brought across the energy that also comes from every page of the book. And I can only hope that many more people read the book. And thanks again for joining us. And I hope to see you in person before too long. Thanks, Leah. Thanks, Ran.
Thank you
so much
Sascha.
for having us.
Thank you, Marco.
Thank you, guys. It was great.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'll see you at the next one.